Chapter 6 Blood and Victory, From the Sons of Mars and the Vengeance of Neptune. By Rory Burke. The End of Battle. The snow had turned crimson, stained by the blood of fallen warriors. The once pure white blanket, which had covered the ground like a frozen sheet, was now marred by the dark, deep red pools that dotted the battlefield. The scent of death hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint traces of wood smoke from the Roman campfires. The chilling wind carried with it the echoes of battle, the clash of steel, the grunts of dying men, and the war cries of the barbarian horde, now silenced forever. The Romans had won. But victory, as always, came at a heavy price. Across the field where the barbarians had once pressed their assault, only remnants remained. Their bodies littered the snow, eyes staring blankly at the cold sky. Some still gripped their weapons, their arms frozen in mid-swing, caught in the final moments of life. The horses of the dead barbarians were scattered across the frozen landscape, some still tethered, others running wild. It was the end of their rebellion, the end of their defiance. And yet, for the Romans, it was only the beginning of a deeper understanding of what war demanded. The smell of blood, the cold wind, the cries of men. It was all a part of what they had been born into, and now, they were forever bound by it. Marcellus Quintus Silvius walked his horse amidst the carnage, his sputher held low, his eyes scanning the battlefield. His mind, sharp as ever, was focused on one thing, one person. Titus. Had the boy made it through the storm? Had he survived his first true test of war? A shadow passed over Marcellus's heart. He had told himself, he had sworn to himself, that Titus would endure, that his training would see him through. But now, walking his horse carefully among the bodies of the fallen, among the twisted shapes of men, who had once roared into battle, and now lay broken in the snow, he felt a creeping fear coil around his chest. What if he had fallen? His heart pounded as he moved forward, horse's hooves crunching over snow, picking its way between the frozen corpses. His gaze darted from one body to the next, searching, praying. He had lost so many men before. He had buried friends, comrades, men who had entrusted their lives to him. But this was his son. His son. If he had lost him, if the gods had taken him, how could he ever return to Rome? How could he bear to look at his own reflection without cursing Mars himself? And then, ahead, through the mist of the battlefield, he saw him. The lion's cub, bloodied, but alive. Titus stood at the heart of the battlefield, still holding his gladius. His armor was dented, scratched and stained with blood. His tunic too was soaked through, much of it his own, though a good portion belonged to his enemies. His shoulder bore a deep gash, the blood oozing from the wound and staining the fabric, but he barely seemed to notice. His breath came in deep, ragged gasps, and his legs trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something else. He was alive. Marcellus felt the breath rush from his lungs, as if he had been struck in the chest. A moment before he had feared he would have to fall to his knees in grief, and now here he stood, his son, battered but unbroken. A prayer of gratitude came instinctively like a torrent from his lips. Praise and thanks be to you, O Mars, mighty god of war. My son lives. The surge of relief nearly took his balance, but even that was second to what came next. Pride. Titus was no longer just his son, he had fought for his place among the men of Rome. His sword had cut through the enemy like a storm, and though his body was battered and bruised, his spirit had not been broken. Marcellus felt his heart swell. This was the boy he had raised. This was the boy he had trained for this very moment. He approached his son slowly, Demetrius's hooves carefully picking their way through the snow. Marcellus's eyes never leaving the figure that stood tall despite the blood and pain. A father's pride. When Marcellus finally reached his son, he dismounted from his horse, his sword still in hand. For a long moment father and son stood face to face, neither speaking. The weight of the battle pressing down on them both. Titus did not bow, did not waver. he met his father's gaze. And in that moment, Marcellus saw him not just as his son, but as a warrior. The blood that covered Titus was no longer just the blood of their enemies, it was a mark of his own survival. And survival in war meant everything. "You are hurt," Marcellus said quietly, his voice steady. Titus winced but nodded, rolling his shoulder. "I will live," he said, his voice tired but resolute. Marcellus studied him for a moment, his eyes softening, before he gave a small approving nod. "You fought well," he said. The words held a weight that transcended any praise a father could give. Titus stood taller, his chest swelling with pride. He had longed for this moment, the moment when he would prove himself to his father. And now, here it was. "I learned from the best," Titus replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Marcellus allowed the faintest of smiles in return. Then, in a gesture rare for him, he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his good shoulder. It was a warrior's gesture, a father's gesture. No more words needed to be spoken. The Legion honors its own. The men of the 20th Legion had gathered around the remains of the battlefield. The once quiet camp now buzzed with a sense of unity, a shared bond between the warriors who had fought together. They had emerged victorious, but they were not yet finished. The battlefield had been won, but the war never truly ended. As they made their way across the battlefield, they came upon Titus standing beside his father. The bloodied sword in his hand, the bruises on his face, it was all a testament to his bravery. The men of the Legion stopped and began to whisper among themselves. At first the murmurs were quiet, then louder, as the veterans recognized the boy for what he had become. "The lion's cub," they whispered. "The lion's cub," they repeated, their voices now filled with respect. Titus turned toward the sound, startled. The men were looking at him with admiration, their eyes wide with approval. These men, seasoned warriors, who had fought alongside his father, now recognized Titus as one of their own. The warrior stood tall, his bloodied sword raised in salute. He had earned it, his father's legacy, his own journey, it had all led to this moment. The Legion roared its approval. "For Titus and Marcellus," they yelled, clashing their swords against their. "Behold the lion's cub!" the men cheered. "Lion's cub! Titus, the lion's cub!" It wasn't just the general's son standing before them, it was a warrior in his own right. "For the lion and the lion's cub!" roared the men of the 20th. And in that moment Titus understood. He was no longer just his father's son. He was a warrior of Rome, the fate of Macro. Amidst the rising cheers, Marcellus turned his attention to a makeshift stretcher, lying just beyond the gathering of soldiers. On it, the great veteran Macro lay, his face pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were still burning with life. As Marcellus approached, Macro, despite his injuries, managed a weak grin. "You fought like a madman, boy," he rasped, looking at the general's son, his voice rough with pain. Titus smirked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I had to make up for you falling over like an old woman." A chuckle rippled through the veterans standing nearby, some with grins on their faces, others wiping away the sweat from the battle. It wasn't often that the men saw such camaraderie in the face of death, but they had been with Macro and Marcellus long enough to know that even in the gravest of moments, their humor could be a shield. Macro grunted, shaking his head, but his eyes twinkled. "If I live through this, boy," he muttered, "I'll teach you some respect." Marcellus, laughing, knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "You will live, old friend," Marcellus said, his voice unwavering. "I have no doubt." Macro gripped his arm tightly, his fingers still strong despite the pain. "Good," he said with a wry grin, "because I refuse to die before I see you win another war." Marcellus smiled faintly, a sense of peace settling over him. "So be it," he said. "We will win, Macro, we will win." And with that, the bonds of friendship forged in blood and battle remained unbroken.